Jayden was only 13, but life had already aged him in ways no child should ever know. While most kids his age were playing baseball after school or watching cartoons with a snack in hand, Jayden spent his afternoons digging through dumpsters and pushing an old shopping cart filled with bottles and cans. The narrow alley off East Monroe Street had become his entire world, a makeshift shelter he called home. It was built from discarded plywood, plastic tarps, and the kind of determination that only comes from surviving the impossible. Inside that shelter lay his mother, Mira. Once a proud, vibrant woman who worked as a caregiver at a local nursing home, she had fallen seriously ill with chronic bronchitis after being exposed to years of poor air quality and cold nights. Without health insurance and no access to consistent medical care, Mira had no choice but to rest all day under layers of worn-out blankets, her body wrapped in layers but never quite warm. Her cough, persistent and painful, echoed through the alley like a sad song Jayden had grown far too used to. Jayden did everything he could. Every morning, long before the sun rose over the city skyline, he grabbed his beat-up backpack and hit the streets. He knew exactly which convenience stores left recyclable items in the back, which fast food joints tossed out yesterday's bread that was still edible. He walked for miles, sometimes over 6 or 7, on cracked sidewalks in shoes held together with duct tape, all in the hope of collecting enough aluminum, plastic, or scrap metal to earn a few dollars. On a good day, he might make $8 or $10 at the recycling center. On bad days, he went home empty-handed. Despite their situation, Jayden never complained. His mother had raised him with grace and gratitude, even when life had been cruel. He still remembered the tiny one-bedroom apartment they once lived in, how his mom used to read him library books at bedtime, how the smell of cinnamon pancakes filled the kitchen on Sunday mornings. That was before Mira lost her job, before the eviction notice, before everything spiraled out of control. At night, Jayden would sit by his mother's side, holding her hand, feeding her spoonfuls of soup heated over a small propane stove. "We're gonna make it, Mom," he'd whisper as she drifted into restless sleep. He didn't know how or when, but Jayden believed it. He had to. For Mira, for himself, and for the promise of something better. In a world that had largely forgotten them, they still had each other. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between the sirens and cold gusts of wind, that was enough to keep going. It was just past 9 p.m. when Jayden began his walk back home. The air was crisp, and the temperature had dropped below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. His thin hoodie did little to keep the cold out, but he kept walking, a half-full sack of recyclables slung over his shoulder. The city around him buzzed in the distance, horns honked, streetlights flickered, but the bridge he crossed on his route home was strangely quiet. It was an old overpass on the edge of downtown, connecting two forgotten parts of the city. Jayden liked it because it gave him a moment of peace, a rare view of the skyline and a place where he could think. That night, though, something felt off. As he reached the center of the bridge, Jayden noticed a tall man standing near the edge. The man was facing the water below, gripping the railing with both hands, his shoulders slumped, his back slightly hunched. The way he stood sent a chill down Jayden's spine. It wasn't the cold kind of chill, but the kind that settles in your gut when something just doesn't feel right. Jayden slowed his steps. "Sir," he called out, his voice hesitant. "Are you okay?" The man didn't turn around. For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind rushing through the steel beams and the occasional car whooshing by in the distance. Then, softly, the man replied, "Go home, kid. This doesn't concern you." But Jayden didn't go home. Something about the man's voice, its sadness, its finality, rooted him in place. I don't think you should be out here alone," Jayden said, stepping closer. "It's freezing." You could get sick." The man let out a bitter laugh, one that sounded like it had been sitting in his chest for years. "Sick," he muttered. "That would be a blessing." Jayden swallowed hard. He'd heard pain before, his mother's wheezing at night, the tears she tried to hide, but this was different. This was a man who had given up. "Whatever happened to you," Jayden said gently, "I promise, it's not too late. My mom always tells me, as long as you're breathing, you still have a chance." Finally, the man turned. His face was worn, his eyes bloodshot, and his cheeks glistened with tears. "You don't know anything about me," he said. "No," Jayden replied. "But I know what it feels like to lose things. To feel invisible." There was a long silence between them. Then, with a shaky breath, the man released the railing and took a small step back. Jayden exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's sit for a while." They sat on the cold concrete, side by side, without speaking. After a few minutes, the man finally said, "My name's Lewis." "I'm Jayden," the boy replied. In that quiet moment, on a bridge forgotten by most, a bond began, one that neither of them expected, but both so desperately needed. The next morning, the sun broke through the cloudy sky, casting a pale light over the city streets. Jayden woke up stiff and cold inside the alley where he and his mother lived. Beside him, wrapped in a quilt patched together from old flannel shirts, Mira stirred with a groggy smile. But something was different today. Outside the shelter, just beyond the alley's brick entrance, sat Mr. Lewis, the man Jayden had met the night before on the bridge. He looked out of place among the garbage bins and broken crates. His coat, though worn, had once been expensive. His shoes, scuffed but sturdy, still bore the faint imprint of better days. Jayden stepped outside, unsure of what to say. "You stayed?" Lewis gave a quiet nod. "Didn't have anywhere else to go. I didn't want to disappear alone." Jayden motioned for him to come in. "It's not much, but we've got hot tea." "Kinda." Inside the small tent-like shelter, Mira was surprised but welcomed the stranger. She could see something in Lewis's eyes that reminded her of the patience she once cared for, people carrying invisible burdens. As they sat together on the ground, sipping weak tea from mismatched mugs, Lewis finally opened up. His voice was low and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of memory. "I wasn't always like this," he began. "I used to own a real estate firm downtown, 3 floors of glass and polished marble. I had a corner office, a secretary, a calendar full of meetings. More money than I ever knew what to do with." Jayden listened closely, wide-eyed. Mira leaned in, recognizing the grief in Lewis's voice before he even got to the heart of it. "I was married," Lewis continued, "to a woman named Diane. Smart, strong, too good for me in a lot of ways. We had a little girl, her name was Emily. My whole world." He paused and stared down at his hands. "But I was always working. Thought I was doing it for them. Vacations skipped, birthdays missed. I figured there'd be time later." Then came the silence. The kind that fills a room and pushes out every ounce of air. Mira reached out gently and touched his arm. "They were driving to see me one evening," Lewis said, his voice cracking. "I'd promised dinner after a long week. A drunk driver blew through a red light." Jayden felt his throat tighten. "Gone," Lewis whispered. "Just like that. My wife, my daughter, my whole reason for being." He went on to describe the spiral that followed: alcohol, depression, selling off the business, burning bridges with friends and colleagues. "I didn't care anymore," he said. "About anything. But last night," he added, turning to Jayden, "you reminded me that there's still something worth holding on to. Even if it's just one more sunrise." In the dim alleyway, 3 lives, one broken, one burdened, and one barely holding on, sat together, quietly realizing that maybe, just maybe, they had something to offer one another. Over the next few days, Mr. Lewis became a quiet but steady presence in Jayden and Myra's lives. He never spoke much unless asked, but his actions spoke volumes. He helped Jayden carry heavier bags on their daily recycling runs and even used a rusted broom to sweep the alley without being asked. Every gesture was humble, as if Lewis was trying to repay a debt only he could feel. But the true shift came one morning when Lewis returned from a walk carrying a bag from a neighborhood pharmacy. It held cough syrup, throat lozenges, and a fresh thermometer. "These should help," he said, setting the items down next to Mira, who was still weak from another sleepless night. Mira blinked, surprised. "How did you?" "I had a little saved," Lewis replied simply. "Hadn't touched it in months. Figured it was time to use it for something real." Jayden stood nearby, speechless. It wasn't just the medicine. It was the fact that someone, outside of him, cared enough to help his mother. That afternoon, Lewis brought out something even more personal, an old, weathered leather notebook. The edges were frayed, and some pages had water stains, but it was filled with careful handwriting, notes, sketches, and plans. "This was my life once," he said, showing Jayden pages filled with building layouts, ideas for nonprofits, and a list of names, some crossed out, some circled. "I used to think I needed to build towers to prove I mattered. Now I think, maybe I just need to build something that helps people." Jayden sat beside him on the sidewalk, intrigued. "Like what?" Lewis smiled faintly. "A second chance. For all of us." The next morning, he returned with groceries, real ones. Fresh bread, canned soup, apples, peanut butter, even a small jar of honey. "The honey's for your mom," he told Jayden. "It's good for her throat." They shared the first warm meal they'd had in weeks around a folding crate they used as a table. Myra's eyes welled with tears as she tasted the soup. "You didn't have to do all this," she whispered. "I know," Lewis replied gently. "But I needed to." Later that evening, Lewis patched up the tarp covering their shelter with duct tape and scraps of vinyl he found at a construction site. He worked until sundown, his hands trembling slightly but determined. Jayden, watching him from a distance, felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't just survival anymore. It was something more, a spark of change. A shared journey. Lewis wasn't just a stranger on a bridge anymore. He was becoming part of their story, and together, they were beginning to write a new chapter, one meal, one breath, one small act of kindness at a time. As the days turned into weeks, Jayden, Mira, and Mr. Lewis began to form a small rhythm, a fragile sense of normalcy. Myra's health started to improve, thanks to proper medicine, warm meals, and Lewis's careful attention. Jayden even smiled more often, something Mira hadn't seen in years. But just as hope started to take root, whispers began to spread. It started in the alleyways, where other unhoused individuals and nearby residents took notice of Lewis's daily comings and goings. He looked different, older, better dressed, more put together than someone typically living on the streets. And his generosity, while genuine, drew suspicion in a world where kindness was often mistaken for manipulation. One morning, as Lewis returned from the grocery store carrying 2 canvas bags filled with canned vegetables, bread, and a box of tea, he passed a pair of neighbors chatting outside a laundromat. Their voices dropped to hushed tones, but Lewis caught enough. "There goes that guy again, the one helping the homeless lady and her kid," one said. "No one does that for free," the other muttered. "He's probably hiding something. Guilt or a record. Why else would he be doing all this?" Lewis said nothing and kept walking, but their words stayed with him like a stone in his shoe. At school, Jayden wasn't spared either. A classmate snickered as he walked by, backpack full of worn-out books. "Hey, charity boy, your sugar daddy buy you lunch today," the boy sneered, high-fiving a friend behind him. Jayden clenched his fists but kept moving. Mira had always taught him to rise above cruelty, but it didn't make the sting any less sharp. Back at the alley, Lewis noticed Jayden was quiet. He handed him a bottle of water and asked gently, "Rough day?" Jayden nodded but didn't say much. He didn't want to burden Lewis further. But Mira, always perceptive, broke the silence. "They're talking about us, aren't they?" she said, her voice low but firm. "I've heard them too. They think this is too good to be true." Lewis sighed. "I expected this. When you've lived through enough loss, people don't understand why you'd still want to give. They think it's pity or some hidden agenda. But that's not what this is," Jayden said quietly. "You're helping us because you care." Lewis looked at him with tired eyes and nodded. "Yes. But that doesn't mean the world will see it that way." That night, they sat together, sharing a simple meal of lentil soup and cornbread. Outside, the city lights blinked indifferently, and a chill wind crept through the alley. Inside their small shelter, however, there was warmth, a flickering flame of trust and belonging. They knew they couldn't silence every whisper or erase every judgment. But what they could do was stand firm in what they knew to be true, that kindness wasn't weakness, and family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes, it was simply about who stayed when the world turned away. The rumors didn't fade. In fact, they multiplied. Whispers on street corners, sideways glances at grocery stores, and murmurs in the school hallway all painted a picture that had little to do with truth. Some said Mr. Lewis was using Jayden and Mira to ease his guilty conscience. Others speculated he had ulterior motives, perhaps a criminal record or an inheritance he was hiding. It didn't matter that none of it was true. In many people's eyes, generosity without strings was suspicious. But instead of shrinking away, Lewis grew quieter, more focused. And then, one Sunday morning, while Jayden helped Mira organize their small belongings in the alley, Lewis returned with a fresh idea and a small stack of flyers. "I've been thinking," he began, crouching beside them. "If people want to question why we're helping each other, maybe it's time we show them what help really looks like." Jayden raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean we turn this into something bigger. We're not the only ones struggling. What if we started collecting donations, clothing, food, blankets, from people I know? Old friends, former colleagues, even neighbors who mean well but don't know where to start?" Mira sat up straighter. Her health had improved steadily, her cough less frequent, her energy slowly returning. "You want to give more? Even after all the talk?" Lewis nodded. "Talk won't change anything. But action might." They began with just a few cardboard boxes labeled "Share What You Can." Lewis made phone calls to people he hadn't spoken to in years, former coworkers, church friends, even a retired pastor who remembered him from his better days. Within a week, those boxes filled with canned goods, scarves, gently worn jackets, and unused hygiene kits. Jayden helped sort items after school. He arranged toiletries into gallon-size resealable bags, packed canned soup by type, and bundled socks with rubber bands. It was hard work, but with each bag he packed, he felt pride, not just for himself, but for what they were building together. Mira, who once thought accepting help was a sign of weakness, now took part by preparing small sandwiches and thermoses of warm tea to hand out alongside donations. Her hands, still a little shaky, moved with a renewed sense of purpose. The small operation caught the attention of others in the community. A local diner offered to donate leftover rolls each evening. A nearby church allowed them to use a corner of their basement for storage. What began as a response to criticism quickly grew into a symbol of resilience and compassion. One afternoon, as Jayden handed a warm coat to an older man shivering near the bus stop, the man looked him in the eyes and said, "Thank you, son. This means more than you know." Jayden smiled. "We're just trying to do some good." And in that moment, surrounded by the same streets that once tried to break them, they realized something powerful. Turning judgment into kindness could light a fire stronger than any rumor. Together, they weren't just surviving anymore, they were changing lives. What started as a few boxes of donations stacked in a church basement quickly blossomed into something much larger than Jayden or Mr. Lewis had ever imagined. Word spread through local neighborhoods like wildfire, not just about the supplies they were handing out, but about the spirit behind the effort. It wasn't charity. It was community. Jayden, once a quiet boy digging through trash for survival, now stood tall, shoulders back, eyes steady. At 14, he was learning how to lead. He organized volunteers, created donation schedules, and even spoke to local businesses about partnerships. His voice had gained strength, but more than that, it carried weight. When Jayden spoke, people listened, not out of pity, but out of respect. One afternoon, Jayden was invited by his social studies teacher, Mr. Harrison, to speak in front of his class. "You've got a story worth sharing," the teacher said, patting him on the shoulder. Nervous but determined, Jayden stood before his classmates, clutching a few index cards that had been rewritten a dozen times. "My name is Jayden," he began. "A year ago, my mom and I lived in an alley. She was sick. I was trying to keep us alive. Then I met Mr. Lewis. He changed our lives. And now, we're trying to help others the way he helped us." By the end of the presentation, the room was silent. Even the students who once whispered behind his back sat with lowered eyes and softened expressions. When Jayden finished, the class erupted in applause. A few students stayed behind afterward to ask how they could help. For the first time, Jayden felt seen not as the boy from the alley, but as a leader. Meanwhile, Myra's health continued to improve. With strength returning to her body and warmth to her spirit, she began leading support circles for women facing housing insecurity and illness. Her wisdom, once limited to whispered advice for her son, now reached a room full of women who needed her voice. She told her story with humility, but never shame. "We've all been through storms," she said. "But storms don't last forever." Mr. Lewis, who once wandered the streets aimlessly, now found purpose again. He handled logistics, drove to pick up donations from across the city, and reconnected with old contacts, people who were glad to see him back on his feet and doing something meaningful. Their little outreach project was now a registered nonprofit called Second Light, named for the idea that everyone deserves another chance to shine. The group moved operations into a donated storefront near the library. They had shelves of canned food, racks of clothing sorted by size, and even a small reading corner for kids who visited with their families. Jayden no longer saw himself as a victim of circumstance. He was a builder, a giver, a voice for those who hadn't found theirs yet. And as the project grew, so did he, step by step, word by word, one act of kindness at a time. Years had passed since Jayden first met Mr. Lewis on that cold bridge. The narrow alleyway, the hunger, the whispers of judgment, they all lived in his memory, but no longer defined him. What began as survival had grown into purpose. And what began as an unlikely friendship had become a lifelong bond. The Second Light Community Center, once a dream scribbled in the margins of Mr. Lewis's old leather notebook, now stood as a vibrant corner of the city. The building, modest but bright, buzzed with life, families picking up weekly groceries, volunteers sorting winter coats, and local seniors sharing stories over cups of fresh brewed coffee in the common room. Jayden, now a young man in his early 20s, stood confidently at the front door each morning, greeting visitors with a smile that mirrored the one Lewis once offered him. He'd grown into his role, not just as a director of the nonprofit, but as a steady presence in the lives of those who came seeking help and hope. Inside, Mira moved through the center with ease. Her once frail frame now full of grace and strength. She helped run health and wellness programs for women and hosted weekly gatherings for caregivers and mothers. Her gentle laugh could often be heard echoing through the building, a testament to resilience. Mr. Lewis, now well into his 70s, had taken a step back from the day-to-day work. Arthritis had slowed his pace, and his once dark hair had turned fully silver. But his eyes, clear, kind, and full of quiet pride, missed nothing. Most afternoons, he sat on a bench just outside the center, sipping sweet tea and watching the world he helped rebuild unfold around him. One warm spring evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft orange and rose-colored hues, Jayden sat beside him on the bench. "You've built something incredible here," Lewis said, his voice low and sincere. "We built it together," Jayden replied. "You started this. You gave me a chance when no one else would." Lewis smiled. "And you gave me a reason to try again." They sat in silence for a while, watching children laugh and chase bubbles on the center's front lawn. Then Lewis placed a gentle hand on Jayden's shoulder. "It's your turn now. The torch is yours. I trust you to carry it." Jayden nodded, emotion rising in his throat. "I won't let you down." "I know," Lewis said. "Because what we started wasn't just about us. It was about everyone who needs to believe that tomorrow can be better." That night, as the center lights glowed warm against the evening, Jayden stood before a crowd of volunteers and families. "We are proof," he said, "that second chances aren't just possible, they're powerful. And together, we will keep passing that light forward." For Jayden, Mira, and Mr. Lewis, family had never been about blood. It had always been about choosing to show up, to believe, and to love, especially when it was hardest. And their legacy, lit by compassion, would shine on for generations to come. The story of Jayden, Mira, and Mr. Lewis reminds us that even in the harshest of circumstances, kindness can change everything. As we grow older, we often reflect on the chapters of our lives, some filled with joy, others with regret. This story speaks directly to that journey. It tells us that it's never too late to make a difference, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of others. Mr. Lewis, once successful but broken by grief, found redemption not through wealth or status, but through compassion. His decision to help a struggling boy and his mother didn't erase his past, but it gave him a future. That's something many of us can relate to, the feeling that we've made mistakes, missed opportunities, or lost people we loved. But Lewis shows us that healing often begins when we reach beyond ourselves. Jayden, despite his young age, teaches us about resilience, gratitude, and hope. He didn't let poverty define him. Instead, he chose to rise, not by stepping on others, but by lifting them up alongside him. And Mira, a mother who had nothing but love and courage, shows us that dignity can live even in a back alley if the heart remains strong. For those of us in the later seasons of life, this story is a powerful reminder: our experiences, both good and painful, are valuable. They can guide, inspire, and comfort others if we're willing to share them. Whether through volunteering, mentoring, or simply offering a listening ear, we each carry the power to light someone else's way. More importantly, it reminds us that family isn't always about blood, it's about the people who show up, who believe in us, and who choose to walk beside us when life is at its hardest. So perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: no matter your age, no matter your past, you still have something meaningful to give. And sometimes, the smallest gesture, a warm meal, a kind word, a quiet presence, can spark a legacy of hope that outlives us all.